we're going to go live and talk about this. So as we talk about ancient Kemet and we talk about various things with respect to the Nile Valley and ancient Egypt and that whole 9 yards, we're going to jump into that and talk about, why do we know more about the civilization than we know about many of the, why do we know more about it and what can we do? Because as I think about this and I think about ancient Kemet and I kind of jump into this, the whole idea of what was taking place in the Nile Valley and in ancient Kemet before 3100 BC speaks to what was taking place from a historical standpoint. Because, we like to draw a line in the sand. The way we are presented history, the way people present history to us, no matter where it is with respect to ancient Kemet or various things, especially from a Western perspective, we're presented history as if everything started at a particular time. It started at this line and this date, and that's when things took place, and that's how we look at it. But you and I know both that when you look at history and you look at things that develop, they don't develop in a exactly this happened on this date and this is how things happen after that. That's just a narrow way and a not true way of looking at the history and looking at the world. Many things obviously come from other things. Many things preceded the things that we talk about in history. And I don't even like us talking about history from the standpoint as if history was, when people started doing certain things and somebody else designated, well, history started 2,000 years ago. Well, that's absolutely, utterly ridiculous. History began as people began. History began as time began, really. I mean, as long as there's time, as long as there are events happening in the universe, that's history, right? And then human history. And if you talk about Earth's history, you're talking about billions of years. You're talking about human history. You're talking about millions of years of development. To limit ourselves to just a few thousand years or 2,000 years or 1,500 years, which is ridiculous, of history, it makes absolutely no sense. So as I think about that, that's the context within which I believe we should be thinking about the Nile Valley. We should not be thinking about the Nile Valley just in terms of what other people say and in terms of just a line in 3100. This is when the two kingdoms, the two areas, Upper and Lower Kemet, were joined and they became a one political entity. That's not how you should think about it, because I think that takes away the contributions of our ancestors. It takes away the contributions of so many people who were doing so many things prior to what we call ancient Kemet, prior to what some people call Egypt. So many things were happening there. So I kind of want to dig into that and jump in, and please put your comments down below because I'd love to hear what you think. And as we talk about, I want to kind of set some things up with respect to what we know about and what we're thinking about. Because if you kind of look at this particular graphic right here, looking at this map, I want to point out a couple of things with respect to ancient Kemet and Upper Kemet and Upper Egypt and that type of thing. So as we look at this and you kind of look at this, you start to see that in this area that is the northern part of what would become ancient Kemet. So we look at what was ancient Kemet, what became ancient Kemet, what was the area that would eventually become and be called ancient Kemet. So we kind of pull that up and look at that. We start, I'll kind of pull up so you can see it also here. What would be the area that will become ancient Kemet? So if you look at this right here, you see where Yebu is, and Yebu is the Kemetic name for what modern people call elephantine. And the reason, just by the way, they call it elephantine was it was such an important port, an important area where there was a transportation as well as just trade going on between folks in Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia. And that place in Elephantine was really, apparently they received so many goods from the farther south in Africa, like ivory, that it came to be known as Elephantine. But in ancient Kemetic times, it was Yebu. So even the word Elephantine, the name Elephantine speaks to the diversity and the trade and the network that was going on in the Nile Valley long before. It was going on long before ancient Kemet was Kemet. It was going on long before that, even though the name obviously comes around after that. So a lot of things were happening in ancient Kemet before then. And as we talk about that and kind of think about that, this whole area that is Yebu, all the way up to where you see Abydos or Abju that the ancient Kemetic people would look at, that whole area was an area that would be the southern part of ancient Kemet. So if you look at where the first cataract is, right here around that first cataract, that is the southern border of what will become Kemet. So Kemet proper, right, the traditional boundaries of ancient Kemet when it became a political union all joined together was from the south around the first cataract of Nile up until like the Delta. And obviously it had parts of the Sinai Peninsula, and there were parts during its development as Kemet would go on and become the Middle Kingdom and a New Kingdom, that it would stretch down into Lower Nubia, eventually Upper Nubia, and well into what we call Syria and Palestine. Today, it stretched all the way there when you think about its empire and its height, especially in a New Kingdom. But long before that, if we go back 4,000 BC, and let's go back 4,000 BC, this is, before the Kemetic entity and unity becomes in 3100 BC, before the first dynasties, if you will, in around 3100 BC. Let's go back 900, even 1,000 years before that, and look at what's happening in this area. And a lot of archaeologists, and you probably have heard of these terms, a lot of archaeological data is centered around what will be Upper Kemet, right? So what will become Upper Kemet. This is the northern part is Lower Kemet, that would become Lower Kemet, and the southern part will be Upper Kemet. Prior to there being that unity, this area that will become Upper Kemet, it's focused on a whole series of towns and resources and activity around this area, and what would be modern day Thebes that we would talk about. And back in the day, it would be Upper Kemet. It's the southern part of Kemet. And many people will talk about, the various challenges, even ethnic challenges and changes and difference between what might be going on in northern Kemet versus southern Kemet, but all these things would develop over time. But here was, according to a lot of the archaeological finds, here was the center of the culture that would become Kemet. It was centered right here around Naqada. You hear Nektin, or they would call it Heracleopolis. Nektin right here, as well as Yebu and Abydos. This was the center of what would become ancient Kemet. This is the center of it. And this is before Kemet becomes a country, before it becomes a political union, all that's happening. And so around 4000 BC, you can see in this area, and it's not that, let's just say up front, it's not that people are not living all up and down Nile Valley. It's not that people aren't all over the world. So I think that's very important to say, because we talk about ancient Kemet and ancient Egypt as if it's like taking place in some vacuum, as if there aren't other things going on around the world. We talk about history so many times, and I think we do that to kind of narrow it, to maybe give advantages to one group of people versus another. History is human history. All of human history is history. All of human history is history. So it's not just 4,000 years ago, or 4,000 BC, or 5,000 BC, or 15,000 BC. All of human history is history. And so when we take a snapshot and look at 4,000 BC and this whole area that's centered around Naqada and Abydos and Nektin, we're talking people are already all around the world. People are in South America and North America. They're in Asia. They have been in Australia for tens of thousands of years, literally tens of thousands of years, maybe 50,000, 60,000 BC. They had already been in Australia. So things are there in India, the subcontinent of India. They're all over, farther south in Africa. They're all over the world. We're just taking out this part and looking at the Nile Valley. So as we look at this area around 4000 BC in the Nile Valley, you will find societies developing. And I don't like this whole word, like I mentioned, prehistory, history, and the way we talk about civilized. We need to get rid of that terminology. We need to stop accepting history the way the Western world wants us to give it, the way the Western world has given it to us for us to receive. We need to reject that, because in a lot of ways it's biased, in a lot of ways it's racist, in a lot of ways it takes away from the contributions of everybody around the world. It makes it seem like only a certain part of the world was important and central to the world, and the people that came out of that world who are connected with Europe are the ones who brought everything that happened in the world. That's just not how history happened. It's all everybody's contributing. So as we look at this and we see this part around 4000 BC, you find that there are societies. There are societies develop. Anytime you get people together and they're working together, there's society. Whether we want to define it this way or not, they're working together. There's society. So you have societies that were developing in around Naqada, it's called Naqada because of the area today, in Abydos, which is Abdu, around Nektin. You have societies, smaller areas, maybe villages, but these societies are together, and in some respects, they're independent. So 4000 BC, you see these independent societies developing all up and down the Nile, and it appears to be that there's a coalescence of things happening in the southern part of Kemet at a greater rate. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that eventually happen in the northern part of Kemet in terms of continuity and cohesiveness, but it seems to be happening in the lower, in the upper part or southern part of Kemet at a greater rate, if you will. So these societies they're small, they're independent, and as time moves on, it's clear that they begin to develop larger and larger coalitions. It could be because maybe there are rivalries taking place. It could be because there's competition, because at this time, as you know, the Sahara Desert, the desert has continued to dry out. And there are people who were all over this part of Africa who were in, Nabta Playa, as we've talked about, in this area of Africa and various places, and obviously farther south in what is today the Sudan, who had to go towards water as this whole drying out took place faster and faster in this area of the world. So you had to go where water was. So you find that in this area, people all up and down the Nile Valley are going towards water, but you also find a cohesiveness that starts to develop in this specific area that will become the southern part of Kemet. And the interesting part about it, because I want to point out, it's important to note, because as I think about this, it is not just Naqada. When you read ancient Kemetic history and you read just history in general in the Nile Valley, you will find that there are other people other than the Naqada, what people like to define as the Naqada culture. I think it's so silly. It's just crazy. We'll look at people living in the same area, almost next to one another, and we'll find one or two or three things that we think are different about one group living right next to another group, and say they were different groups and they must never have, and they never connected, or they never developed a connection in any meaningful way, and we must therefore talk about our history as if they were completely separate. Like, it makes no sense. When you study the A group Nubians, and don't just take my word, but read it. You can find a whole lot of things coming out of the University of Chicago and various places where a lot of studies were done looking at A group Nubians. They were not just in Lower Nubia, in this area. Their territory actually extended into what would become Kemet, the southern part of Kemet. So the same area that we're talking about, that would be Nekton and Naqada and Abydos and above the first cataract, above Aswan, the same area above Aswan around 3800 BC, 3600 BC had A group Nubians, specifically Nubian people. And when you look at their burial practices, people being in a fetal position, how they were buried, artifacts being buried with them. When you look at the pottery and various things, you see a lot of similarities in terms of what the A group people were doing and the people in Naqada. So it just seems, mind-boggling to me that we would look at people in Naqada and say that they are the forerunners of the Kemetic culture, because we say that, and you see a lot of Egyptologists and archaeologists will say that, and the evidence points to that, and that somehow they were totally not related to people who we call A group Nubians, even though they lived in the same area for a period of hundreds of years. Somehow they never interacted. We look at other people in various parts of the world and say, of course they interacted. We know there's just no way there was not a culture developing here. And there was not interactions between people who were Nubians, A group Nubians, and people who might have been Naqada, people who may have been in various societies developing in this area who had different traditions. And they might have developed, slightly different ways and slightly different, values, slightly different things that they focused on. Even if you look at history in America and you see America, 10,000 years ago, America 3,000 years ago, what we call America today, you will find people developing in various ways where they had shared culture, but they branched off. They may have had one particular thing that they enjoyed, or maybe there was an argument or a dispute, or maybe there was something, political or something environmental that happened that forced them to do something different, maybe even political differences. But it doesn't mean that they did not have a shared culture. It doesn't mean that they were not closely connected because they developed in different ways or chose to focus on specific things. So I want to make that point very clear that the A group Nubians, you can find them anywhere from 3800 BC to 3100 BC in the same area within the borders of what will become southern Kemet. They're there inside the border. So this whole idea that ancient Kemet developed and there were no Nubians there seems crazy to me. And I know people will say, well, the Nubians died out, or maybe they were enveloped in the culture of ancient Kemet. They started to do some more specific cultural things that was developing in that area of the world in terms of the Naqada culture, which is probably more likely the case, because the idea that a raid took place, or several raids and wars, and killed every single person of a particular group is not likely. It's more likely that some people died, and more likely that people just joined together and just began to work with the dominant culture, the culture that was coalescing, the culture that was dominant. So this idea that there were no Nubians in ancient Kemet before Kemet became Kemet is not true. The archaeology points that they were there. And so it points to that. So as I look at that, and we kind of jump into that, we start to look at various things that become symbols of it. And this woman right here is a symbol of a woman from about 3400 BC or 3100 BC or thereabouts. And she is a woman in this Naqada culture. She's a woman in this area in the Nile Valley who is a beautiful woman, and it's an amazing figure. It's an amazing figure of this woman who I think represents so much of this area. She represents so much of what was happening in the Nile Valley. Her look, her contributions, what was going on before, Kemet became Kemet, before Egypt became Egypt, before there was a first dynasty. We almost just ignore this. We almost ignore the symbols that were in place. We ignore the culture that was in place, because prior to Kemet becoming Kemet, prior to there being the first dynasty around 3100 BC, there is already symbolism. There's already religion. Writing is already developed. You even have hieroglyphics and abydos in the southern part of Kemet. You even have hieroglyphics that are phonetic, right? That are like we use our alphabet. We use sounds for our alphabet. A, B, C, we use sounds for them. There are phonetic symbols and hieroglyphics in place before Kemet is a country, but a unified political unit, some 3200 BC in abydos. So you see writing in place, phonetic writing in place. You see symbols such as Haru and the falcon that will become to represent Haru, and kings, even kings prior to the kings that we look at, the rulers prior to the rulers that we look at in terms of Kemet. You see Haru, you see the falcon, you see the surrect and the symbol that represent house or state property. You see that there in Naqada. You see these symbols long before Kemet is Kemet. So as we start to look at it, and we look at the wonderful symbols there and the people that were there, we start to realize that it's more than just what people want to look at. It's more than just what people want to say with respect to ancient Kemet, as we kind of pull this together. So I want to make that point. So you have around 4000 BC, you have these coalescence of various small societies, small villages getting together and joining to make stronger and stronger, forces, if you will. They join together and to make stronger and stronger units. And that joining together is a significant part. So imagine how hard that must have been. You're living, 6,000 years ago, and you are getting together individual societies that may have their own preferences, their own rulers, their own structure, and you start to develop coalitions. And those coalitions form, and you end up having maybe a ruler or some type of governance over a collection of societies now. So you have a collection of villages, a collection of societies, and they begin to coalesce around various areas. So in places like Abydos and Naqada and Nektin and Yebu and El Kab and all up and down this area, you have at least around 8 or so groups, if you will, that form in this area. And I kind of want to point out, so you can kind of see the names as you begin to look at it yourself, so you can kind of take a look at that. So these areas become areas that are pulling together resources, and they become centers of power. Really, you're talking about centers of power. And when you think about Naqada, they separate it. You think about a whole general area, and it is a general term given, kind of taken after the name Naqada, a more of a modern name, taken after that general area because of the archaeology that was done in that area. And they break it down from Naqada 1, 2, and 3. And then you have subsets. You have like 1A and 2A and that type. So you have subsets that go from A to D. So you have Naqada 1, 2, and 3, and subsets associated with them, A through D. And you end up having them look at all these different periods and kind of chop it up and say, what do we see that's similar? What do we see in terms of grave sites? What do we see in terms of symbolisms, in terms of religion, how people are buried? And a lot of it comes from cemeteries, just like what you find in Kerma and Yam and ancient Kush. A lot of this comes from cemeteries. A lot of this comes from burials. You will find people talking about burials and finding things that give you a lot of information about what they believed in. In a lot of these places, you will find them have burial mounds, and you will find a person laying on their side with their face facing west, maybe with their hands cupped, and you will find them in a fetal position, and you will find pottery, sometimes cosmetic goods, and you find this up and down the Nile Valley. It's not just here. You find very similar things, maybe slight differences here, but you find very similar things in terms of the way people were buried. In ancient Kemet, before it was Kemet, and even when you go farther south in Nubian, A group, you find similar things. It looks very similar when you see it. But these areas here, so Abydos, Naqada, Abidaya, Jebelin, Nekhin, El Kab, Edfu, Yebu, all of these areas become centers of power. As time moves on, and as these cities kind of develop, these areas become centers of power. And eventually, as Naqada, that period that they call Naqada, moves on, there are 3 powers that emerge. Out of that 8 group, if you will, that become centers of power, other coalitions take place. And then you end up having Abydos or Abdu, you end up having Naqada and Nektin becoming these centers of power. And so you find that out of those original 8, or those 8 that form, you end up finding 3 that really become very powerful. And those 3 become really significant in the development of ancient Kemet. They become significant in that they are the forces that drive what's taking place in ancient. They are the forces that start to drive the push from the upper part of Kemet and the southern part up north. So you start to find, in Abydos, in Nekton, as well as and that whole area around you start to find specific things that take place in Naqada. You start to find specific things that take place where when you look at ancient Kemetic history and you start to read later things that happen, you see them refer to Abydos quite a bit and refer to Abydos in an ancient way. You see them refer to Nekton quite a bit and you see them refer to it in an ancient way. You start to get to realize the reason why they're referring to these things in these cities and these areas in such an ancient way is because they were powers. They were actually there for a long period of time. And we like to look at ancient Kemet as if it was, here's dynasty 0. We even say dynasty 0 and some dynasty 0, dynasty 1, and here's where things started. And while they definitely look at that as important times, they also look beyond those times. They also look to a time when the ancestors were on the earth and things were slightly different. They also look to places like Punt as being the place where their ancestors came from and the place where God was God's land. So that makes sense to you. You start to think about them looking at Punt as being where their ancestral home was and where God lives, God's land, and the fondness they had for pygmies and saying that pygmies did the dances of God and even brought pygmies in the old kingdom to before kings, before pharaohs to dance the dance of God. You start to see that it makes sense. It's not beyond the realm of understanding when you understand that this is where the center of power began to coalesce in ancient Kemet. So as you had these centers and these villages begin to coalesce into power structures, you saw them push north. They start to push north, and as they push north farther and farther, you start to see them take over places that are in what would be a lower Kemet, which would be in the northern part of Kemet. And the interesting part about it is as you start to see that push, you begin to then see a sort of a unification. You begin to see people from the very early dynasties, even pre-dynastic Kemet, being in the Sinai, being in this area. You see images of Namur or Menzies, you images of Serek. You see thousands of images and thousands of resources or artifacts are found in the Sinai in various places, even going into the Levant. In this early period of pre-dynastic and this early period of Kemet history, you see an expansion of Kemet, and you see it farther south too. It's not as easy and as black and white as we like to put it, that there's this line in the sand and there was no interaction with ancient Kemet and the people of the south, or there was only this type of interaction with ancient Kemet and people to the northeast. It really was much more open than that, and really not as black and white as people like to put it. But I want to kind of point out a couple of things here, because as we look at this, you start to see the imagery. And the imagery is striking. So you can see this woman, you can see this right here. This is a Naqada. This is, 3,600 or 3,400, 500 years before Christ. Before Kemet is Kemet, right? Once again, we're talking before Egypt. This is an example of a woman, and she's doing some type of ceremony. And it's believed that this is representing her dancing. And as you see these symbols, it's not just one of them. You can see several symbols of women depicted as if they're doing dances and ceremonies. And when you look at these amazing artifacts, a couple of things you notice. One, the women are shapely, right? The women are shapely. They show women with hips that are shapely. And I don't believe that was just an artistic approach. And I believe the women were shapely. The women had hips, right? So they're showing the women as they look. They show them as hippie, and that was a beautiful thing. That was a beautiful thing that they looked at. And this is, like I said, 3,500, 3,400 years before Christ. These are beautiful, shapely women in Africa who are being depicted doing these dances, right? And it's interesting when you look at these dances. I want to show you several pieces of pottery. If I can make this bigger as we look at it, I want to show you this pottery. You can see in the pottery right there above my head, these are example. You see again, these are women. And you can see somewhat shapely. I'll show you another example where she's doing a dance. It's a ceremony, and it's on a boat. And I want to mention they're showing boats with oars. This is 3,600 years before Christ. This is 5,600 years ago at least. And you find them showing boats with oars. And I say this because I've told people this, and some people will say, oh, that doesn't happen. This is what happened. I remember being in school, in junior high school, and having my teacher tell me that boats, and that the first people to develop boats and were basically Vikings. And I wanted to challenge that, but I was younger. I was a child. I didn't have the information or the gumption, if you will, to challenge that. But I knew that was wrong. And she told our whole class that we had the Vikings to thank for boats, and it didn't even make really a distinction around seafaring boats. But it didn't matter because people were already in Australia 60,000 60,000 years ago. People were already in Australia, guys, 60,000 years ago. They had boats, they had vessels, vehicles that were water ready to get them to places that were surrounded by water. So this whole idea that this again it's an example in history where people just like to draw lines. They like to segregate us, right? Just to draw us apart and say, this has nothing to do with the other. You know, the Vikings in Northern Europe are the first people to really develop, you know, boats that we consider boats, and then it becomes first to consider develop boats, and they go and conquer the world and show the rest of the world about boats. I mean, this is what they're saying. And this is what I was told without very much qualification on it. We should look to the Vikings to be thankful. And this is years ago, being in junior high school, but I was told this in school, and I know of other people who were told similar types of things. And so I want to make that point. Human beings are doing things all over the world, right? And here you have depictions of boats in the Nile Valley, 3,600 years before Christ, long before the Vikings did the things that they did. I mean, I'm not dissing the Vikings. They did the things they did, but they did it when they did it. And these are people who did it when they did it. So when you look at this, you'll see other examples. As I kind of pull up here, you'll see other examples as we look at some other pottery. I want to kind of point this piece of work out to you as well as you look at that. You can see here once again the women with the hands kind of going up. You can see the women right here with the hands kind of going up really, really specifically. And what you notice here is a succession of women. And notice that they're shapely. As I mentioned to you that you saw the figurines I just showed, which I'll show you again, where the women have hips and they're shapely and you see them doing dances. Well, the pottery is showing the same thing. They're showing women with hips. And when they show the men, they just show the men with phalluses. So you can see that they're men, and they're not decorating the women in these pots with respect to their breast or their chest, if you will, to show that they're women. They're using their hips to show that. They use the phallus of the men to show that they're men, but they use the women's hips. And that becomes a significant thing because women's shapes, right? We like to look at there being a particular type of Nile Valley woman. And we like to look at a particular standard of beauty. But when you look at ancient Africa and you look at Northeast Africa, you see women with hips. You see women, shapely women who are depicted in artifacts, ancient artifacts that we never show, right? That we never talk about. I don't care if it's Queen Amani-Renas or Amani-Tori, later on in the Sudan, much later on, thousands of years later, or we're talking about the women who are depicted here in Nile Valley civilization, pre-Kemet, pre-Egypt, pre the joining of the two lands, shown right here with wonderful shapely bodies, shown in figurines that show them with shapely bodies, and that's something I think we should explore. We should stop, looking at this one, idea of what Nile Valley beauty was. This was Nile Valley beauty. This was a Nile Valley woman, and she wasn't shaped this way because, some artistic choice. She was shaped this way because this is how they looked. That's the reasonable explanation. This is how they showed women with shapely bodies and shapely hips. And I think we should celebrate that and look at that standard of Nile Valley beauty and not what people want to show us. They want to show us depictions of Nefertiti from a particular time. No dissing anybody with respect to that. But that's one example, but that's not the standard of beauty that everybody has beauty. Everybody has something to contribute. And this was something that the ancestors in the Nile Valley looked at as beautiful, as women, as something that was significant. And the pottery that's depicted here shows examples of women doing ceremonies. So these are more than likely religious ceremonies. Obviously, we don't know everything people were doing at the time, but these are more than likely religious ceremonies taking place on boats that were going up and down the Nile. And as far out as we might imagine, and they're using oars and they're using specific things, and you see cabins on there, and you see women depicted prominently. You don't see them as being like, sitting down worshiping the men, right? You see women depicted a lot of places in Africa, a lot of places in Northeast Africa, especially as you go later on the Kush, will have women in powerful positions. We'll have women as priests. Women doing specific things when it comes to religious rites. Women being respected when it comes to religion. Women being generals and leading armies. Women being in charge of the country outside of them having to have a male counterpart, outside of the king or whatever, or co-ruling at the same time. You see that amazingly taking place farther back in history. And so I wanted to point that out of women being shown in beautiful ways, in very specific, natural ways, and not just in terms of the way we want to show Nile Valley people. So, next time people want to show you example of a woman in Nile Valley and they try to show you a specific type of woman and show you only one type of woman, show them this. Remember this. Look up Naqada. Look up some of the things that show and talk about ancient Kemetic, pre-Kemetic art, pre-Kemetic depictions of women. Show them that there were more than one type of woman there in ancient Kemet in the Nile Valley before there being the joining of the two lands, and that these were significant people. These were things that were happening that were significant in ancient Kemet. That way we should look at it. And I'll give you a little bit of an example of, you can kind of look at some of the images here, just so you can see that, as you can take a look at some of the images here, so you get a chance to see that. So, but as you look at that, I think it's significant for us to take perspective of that, because there's not just one type of woman, there's not just one type of person in the Nile Valley. There is a significant coalition that's taking place in ancient Kemet, 4,000 to 3,000 BC, and these are people who are joining forces, who are coalescing, and they begin to move north. They move north. And they began to, according to archaeological evidence, take over areas. And so a lot of times, if you read, and we'll be talking about this, if you read King Unas and his pyramid text, he talks about the white crown of Upper Kemet, of southern part of Kemet, taking over the northern crown, the white crown swallowing, if you will, the northern crown, talking about how the southern part of Kemet came and took over at the beginning. So this is King Unas in the 5th dynasty. So obviously he's talking about something that happened before him, the white crown coming and taking over and swallowing the red crown, and that being a significant event in the joining of two lands. When you see this, even when you go to the Middle Kingdom, Mentuhotep II, he's coming from the southern part of Kemet and Upper Kemet, and he's rejoining the two lands from the south to the north, even in the New Kingdom. So you start to see that this coalition, this whole idea of there being various things that's happening in ancient Kemet, from the earliest times, and that, there is no like magic force field that's in place. Like, people almost make it want to seem like there's no interaction with Nubia. And as I mentioned, the A group people were all up and down here. They were all in the area that would become Southern Kemet. They were there at the same time as this Naqada culture. They overlapped, right? And you just see differences in culture, not necessarily differences in color, not necessarily differences in ethnicity, but you would see eventually there be different groups of ethnicity, different groups of people in ancient Kemet that were able to somehow coalesce. They were able to somehow get along. But what's significant is, it's not like you have a major force field right here in Lower Nubia where there's not interaction back and forth. There's interaction all up and down the Nile Valley, especially when you understand that people had tens of thousands of years, literally hundreds of thousands of years, to travel up and down this area. People literally had this time, and I'll just to pick and go back tens of thousands of years, they literally had tens of thousands to go up and down the Nile Valley and to spread and to move up and down. So this is an area that's more free, that's more open than what people like to think, and that you cannot really look at ancient Kemet as just starting in 3100 BC. You have to understand that the culture that was there was already in place many years before 3100, many years before the first dynasty. That the religious culture, writing was in place, a lot of symbolism, a lot of structure was in place, and we see that happening right in this area. And ancient Kemet, you see that coalescence begin to take place, and it takes time, right? So from the archaeological evidence from about 4000 BC to about 3100 BC, you see this coalescence, and you see evidence in their cemetery, evidence in trade. You see all of this coalescence, and you see the southern culture begin to take up and swallow the northern culture. You can see that. But the interesting part about it, if you study this and look at this, and God bless you. Hope you have a good one. God bless you. Hope all is well with you. If you study and look at this, you will find that archaeologists will say there is no difference in archaeological material when you get to the end of the Naqada period in this area right here and the beginning of the dynastic period. There is no difference. Exactly. In fact, when you look at the end of the Naqada period, it really just bleeds into, and we just start calling it dynastic period. We just call it that, and we start to number the kings, and we start to pick a line in a particular event. But it's not that the culture changed. There was no significant change in culture archaeologically that people can point to from this area that said this is when the Naqada period was no longer here, and then something major cultural difference took place that made dynastic Egypt. There is none. There was simply, we just started calling it, we just call it different now. We just call it different. The culture is there, the archaeological material there, and what you see is just development. right? And that's why a lot of times people will make a distinction between, I believe, between the first two dynasties of ancient Kemet and the Old Kingdom. So you will see people talk about the first dynasties, and they will talk about the Old Kingdom not being a part of, they separate the first two dynasties from the Old Kingdom. So the Old Kingdom is like dynasties 3 through 6, or some people will say dynasties 3 through 8, but it begins with dynasty 3 with the building of the step pyramid in that era, if you will. But the first two dynasties are not considered the Old Kingdom. Isn't that kind of funny? You would think that kind of be kind of counterintuitive, but they don't call that the Old Kingdom. But I think part of the reason is because they say so many specific things happened in the Old Kingdom that it's a distinct part of Kemetic history. It's a distinct part of the agriculture to develop, like the step pyramid and the pyramids themselves, and the use of mastabas and various things in the pyramid text, that becomes a special part of Kemetic history. But it's not like they didn't come from the first two dynasties. And it's not like the first two dynasties were not just an extension of what was already happening in this whole Naqada period and this whole area around Abydos and Nekton in the southern part of Kemet. They literally just blend. So we call it that, but there is no difference archaeologically from the material that's been found from the Naqada culture that ends and the dynastic culture that begins. It's one and the same. It's just an extension, and it's how we look at it. So I wanted to share that. I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are and how you kind of jump into this, because I think it really becomes very significant as we look at the Kemetic people, and we look at when history began, that there are many people in the Nile Valley, many people that go way back who are the precursors, the ancestors of the Nile Valley. And they have Nubian people in that area. There are people in Naqada, we like to call. They're Kemetic ancestors. There are people who say there are people who are coming from parts of the Sinai Peninsula and east, and there are people who are in the lower part or the northern part of Kemet who are there, and they become one people. They become one country. And it takes a lot of wars. It takes a lot of fight, but you have people coming from all over the place, whether they're settling in the north, whether they're already there in the south, whether they're Nubian people who are mixing, whether they're all types of cultures and societies that are developing, and that are finding their way. They're developing into what will become Kemet. They're developing into what will become what we would call eventually Egypt later, many, many thousands of years later. So I just wanted to say that. God bless you. Thank you for watching. And please put any of your comments down below. I'd love to read them, and talk to you soon.